Now, in my segment, I'm going to be providing a potted history of Iranian's post-war tragedy. And I'm going to do this in order to address both the Western claim that this war, these bombs, and these killings are all about restoring democracy and normality, and a related, more leftist view that somehow the Iranian regime is on the progressive side, which I don't believe it is. Speaking of Iran's post-war tragedy, I think the year that we have to start at is 1953. There was a chance in 1953 that Iran would develop into a modern democracy. Mohammad Mossadegh, had been elected in free and fair elections, and lo and behold, the CIA toppled him, together with British intelligence. America and the United Kingdom, at that point, lost any moral claim as supporters of Iranian democracy. They put Iran into a trajectory of insidious authoritarianism. They installed the corrupt fascist regime by the Shah that built his authority on Iran's Gestapo, the Savak, the very brutal Savak. And, after all that, when you implant such an authoritarian, I would say fascist regime, then it's simply a matter of time before there is a revolution, there is a rebellion. That happened in 1979. The Iranian revolution in 1979 was not just an Islamist revolution. There were leftists, there were liberals, there were communists involved in this broad coalition to topple the Shah. This was, remember, 1979. It was a time when financialization was emerging in the West. The neoliberal order was being established by Margaret Thatcher in Britain, by Ronald Reagan in the United States. At that time, before the dust had settled during the Iranian Revolution, lest we forget, the United States and Western governments were aligned during this revolution with the most reactionary factions of that revolution. Whom am I referring to? Islamic fundamentalists like Khomeini, who, upon seizing power, the first thing the Khomeini regime did was to eradicate the left. They actually murdered every single member of the leadership of the left-wing Communist Party to death. The great tragedy of Iran therefore sets in. We have an Islamic republic that is attempting, supposedly, to resurrect some kind of Islamic civilization by adopting, on the one hand, an anti-imperialist, anti-American rhetoric, while at the same time crushing the left and the left's opposition to theocracy. Now, what was the regime's greatest strength? Among the poor and devastated masses of the Muslim world, devastated by colonialism, by the shenanigans of the great European powers and the United States, the Islamic regime's rhetoric that talked about not only income redistribution, but also against the corruption of their bourgeois classes, and genuine support for the Palestinians. That narrative offered to the masses in Western Asia, the Middle East as we call it here in the West, it offered them a rare source of emancipatory hope. And, of course, brought on a massive confrontation with the historical rival, the Sunni rivals, that were represented in the Gulf's plutocracy, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, and so on, and the abandonment by that plutocracy, both of their own populations, their masses, and the Palestinians. A year later, again, let's not forget, the United States weaponizes its stooge in the region. The American stooge in the region was Saddam Hussein. They pushed him to invade Iran. And we had the Iran-Iraq war that lasted 8 years. Very soon after that, 1982, Israel's illegal and awful invasion of Lebanon, that devastated Lebanon. The devastation of Lebanon gave birth to Hezbollah, allowing the Iranian regime to present itself as the only force capable of protecting the Arabs, the Muslims, I should say, from Israel's war machine. And that brings us to 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the total domination of the neoliberal order, that even celebrated idiotically the end of history, the spreading of poverty in the region, the spreading of exploitation of poor Muslims by richer, mainly Sunni Muslims, which, that spread reinforced and legitimized the Iranian regime's predatory expansion in the region. Before long, the Islamic Republic faced war on all fronts, even though it never invaded any country. It has to be said that. And finally, we moved now in the early 1990s with the Gulf War, which was precipitated by the United States, essentially inciting through the American ambassador in Kuwait, inciting Saddam Hussein to take Kuwait. This was an inter-Western dispute over money, because Kuwait had funded Iraq and wanted its money back, even though Iraq had carried out that war on behalf of their overlords, the United States. The result of this first Gulf War, as we know, is the rise of Sunni terrorism, Sunni fundamentalism, Al-Qaeda, again, an internal Western affair. And Iran emerges as the only bulwark against Sunni terrorism, against Al-Qaeda, against American imperialism simultaneously. Who forgets that in Iraq, after the invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush, that gave rise to ISIS, and ISIS would never have been defeated in Iraq if it wasn't for the intervention of Iran, of the Iranian regime. I'm saying all this because it is important to remember and to understand that the Islamic Republic, this regime, this very authoritarian theocratic regime, is a powerful system that emerged organically and was born out of an intertemporal crisis that begins in 1953, a crisis that was caused by the United States and by the fact that the United States, aided and abetted by Israel, never wanted democracy, never wanted normality in Iran. Now let me, Wolfgang, before you come in, let me debunk my leftist friends' delusion that Iran is a broadly progressive regime aligned to the left and to anti-imperialism. And what I'm going to say to them, Wolfgang, is, I'm addressing the leftists now, is don't forget that since 1979, the Islamic regime's economic model has been quite neoliberal. It is a neoliberal type of capital accumulation that they were aiming at. There was a privatization process, I don't know how many people know that has been in full swing since the 1990s, at least. And the clash between the reformist faction and the conservative faction is what? The reformist faction envision foreign investment and they want to integrate into the Western world market, especially essentially the European Union and the UK, and the United Kingdom mainly. Okay, while at the same time the conservative coalition under the Revolutionary Guards were far more interested in establishing a labyrinth of private enterprises that they controlled. And once the Obama project of killing off the idea of reintegrating Iran to the West, those Revolutionary Guards, but always focusing on private business, not on some kind of socialistic idea, they turn towards China. And the result is a deregulatory environment which caused significant poverty, significant rates of exploitation, which gave rise to the opposition in Iran. And, you know, in 2022, triggered by the killing of Masha Amini, the 17-year-old girl, who, by the way, let's remember that, is a Kurdish Sunni, that created a mass movement which are not interested in the American and European project of regime change as they see it. In other words, permanent instability, because this is what the Americans want in Iran. This is what Netanyahu wants in Iran. Netanyahu wants to turn Iran into a new Syria, a devastated country, a country that has no capacity of functioning and produces general and permanent instability. Yeah, the people who are fighting against the Iranian regime don't want that. And here's how I'm going to conclude. The only reason why the regime manages to survive is because even amongst its opponents in Iran, they have managed to convince a very large section of them, maybe not a majority, but a large minority, that if that regime falls, it will be Syria. It will be the disintegration of a country and, you know, the conversion of it into a form of Syria or Libya. This war is the greatest gift to the regime.
Yeah, I agree. This is often the case that regimes, when they come under attack, survive. And this is clearly happening here in the regime by doubling down and also by attacking US and Israeli allies in the region. While this has a political cost to them, this was a very smart strategy because it hit the West at its most vulnerable. I also agree with you that the war goal is not to establish democracy in Iran. That's just nonsense. The goal is clearly to turn the country into to seize it to be a threat to others. And that one way of achieving that is by turning it into a dysfunctional state. The protest movement is indeed not it's not organized. There isn't anyone to take ready to take over. Very different to 79. The crown prince, as they call him, his goal is just to make money and to make money for the United States. He is not a leader of anybody in Iran. He's just a media phenomenon, someone who appears on talk shows. There is no support within the country of the descendants of the previous regime. There isn't a democratic movement. And in any case, we don't have the credibility. European politicians, while having criticized the American war, have also said that they are not particularly interested in human rights, because human rights or international law, because that doesn't apply in this case. They only apply it for the kind of situations that they want to apply it to. So we're basically moving to a situation where we should basically recognize international law is dead. Everybody uses it to their own advantages. They think they need to keep the narrative over national law. It's by the definition of international law is that we don't decide what it is, but that you give it to some court and let the court decide whether this is legal or not. And the United States has already has clearly extricated itself from those processes, and the Europeans are now supporting this. So international law is dying by our own actions, and we are vindicating Putin's war in Ukraine. If we've been saying this was a violation of international law, which I believe it was. But, through our own actions, we are basically turning this into a relative statement. Yeah, you violate the international law, we violate it. You deny it, we deny it. It's basically, that's the game we're playing on now. There's nobody has a moral high ground. And the idea that we would like to establish democracy, it's not for us. Why should we feel responsible for giving other countries or imposing regimes on other countries? Regime change is a fundamentally wrong thing to want. It is clearly a violation of international law. This is not something for us, for anybody to do. This is not what international law suggests we do. It's about power, it's about money, it's about the serving of interests. Now, I don't want to go into this why did Trump do this, whether it was Netanyahu or whether something else drove him, whether they got blackmailed. I mean, people have all sorts of theories about this. I just don't know. And I think, there isn't the information out there that we know. But from the action of Trump and Netanyahu, we do know they want to destroy the social and political fabric of the country, which is also why I don't believe in a short war, because those goals cannot be achieved in 3 or 4 weeks of bombings. The only way to get rid of them is to actually launch ground troops into the country, which is exactly what Trump wanted to avoid. But then we are in the scenario of the oil price going up to $200. We are in the scenario very close to what it was in the 1970s, when it had really lasting, pernicious economic effects. And that is now a scenario that becomes at least possible. Now, I said my prime scenario is that Trump will just make a quick exit, because he's certainly not a war leader. You don't win wars by firing off angry tweets. But, it is a possibility that he might be under pressure to actually go all in, and that this might then become, the defining war of our century, and probably the biggest foreign policy disaster that the United States has had historically. And that's a scenario with absolutely profound implications for geopolitics.
Well, I also am not prepared to speculate as to what what happened within the Donald's brain to make this ridiculous decision to start a war without a plan, without an exit plan. But when it comes to Netanyahu, it would be remiss of me not to be very clear on that. After the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, Wolfgang, a murder that put an end to any peace project that was happening before that. I mean, by the way, who says that terrorism doesn't pay? It paid in the case of Rabin's murder. Since then, Netanyahu, for 30 years now, has been in the business of cultivating insecurity in the region and amongst Israeli Jews, in order to maintain a permanent war so as to complete Sharon's plan ethnically to cleanse and then annex the West Bank. I mean, he's been saying this. This is not a question of our interpretation. And in so doing, Netanyahu has strengthened inordinately the Iranian regime all these years. It's the only one that, despite its brutality and crony capitalism, has shown some kind of commitment to the cause of the Palestinians, unlike the Sunni regimes of the Gulf. So here we are today. We have Khamenei's son. He's now the new supreme leader of Iran. let's not forget that the United States and Israel killed his father, his mother, his wife, his sister, and most probably, from what I've been reading, his son. So this is not a regime that's not going to go away fast. It is the result of American choices, misanthropic American choices that date back to 1953. Europeans, Brits, Aussies, and Canadians must understand that from the perspective of Iranians, most of the vast majority of Iranians, not just regime supporters, but regime opponents, the West is the problem. It is not the solution.
And that's all we have time for today. I would like to alert you to a session of the Iconoclasts Live, which we will be holding on March the 23rd in Westminster. For details, please visit the websites unheard.com/Iconoclasts Live.
I can't wait to see you there. Until then, don't forget to rate, like, and subscribe.